What's up? Today's like the second prayer corner video in like a week. But that's kind of my MO. So what we're talking about today, I want to talk about why I'm back to the iPhone, Apple Watch, and the MacBook. Why I've left free software, basically. And so I guess I should start with kind of like where I started to begin with, even with free software at all. Because I've flip-flopped a couple of times. Like, if you know me, you know that I like every 6 months I go through a phase where I switch back and forth. But I'm done now. Like, I'm where I am. I'm not switching back. If I switch back, like, have me arrested. Like, I'm done. So where I started was way back in high school. Like, I think junior year, I was using a Windows laptop for class, and I was really getting into Raindrop. Like, if you wanted like a count, like a cool looking on Windows 10, if you wanted like a cool looking calendar widget, like weather, you needed a program called Raindrop. And the only configuration videos I could find for it were people using Vim. And kind of around that time, I was like self-teaching multivariable at that point. And so I was trying to typeset, calculus equations, and the only way to do that really is with LaTeX. So getting into LaTeX and getting into Vim, I discovered Linux, and I discovered Luke Smith. And man, I went all the way down that rabbit hole. Like, senior year of high school, I was like already into Artix and like shell scripting, and then COVID hit, and then I had like all the time in the world to get into Gentoo and BSPWM, and then into the suckless tools as they became more popular. And so, like I said, I went all the way down that path, like all the way down to self-hosting encrypted OpenBSD servers on, for mail and for just websites in general. Like, I even had an XMPP channel that Luke Smith was in, and I would host like a Jitsi server for my close family and all these things, and like an email server that people would be on. That was really cool. But, that time's kind of over. And I think part of the reason for that really has to do with, it's time to get serious. Like, if you're using a tool, it's got to get work done. And you have to be able to collaborate with other people. And if you're trying to like open Zoom because your school needs it or your job requires it, or a WebEx or whatever, and your X220 lights on fire and like the fans go so hard that it lifts off the table, like, you're doing something wrong. And so I tried that. I did that for a while. Actually, funny story. So first year of my master's degree, I have a degree in economics. First year of that, I was using a Libre booted ThinkPad X200 from 2008. Okay, it was so old the screen turned yellow, and it was Libre booted, and it had like an Atheros Wi-Fi card, which, if you don't know, is like the only Wi-Fi card you can get that has like free and open source drivers. Okay, but here's the issue: using that plus OpenBSD on university Wi-Fi, it's PEEP, and there was no driver to authenticate. So, rather than not using OpenBSD or, using a different Wi-Fi card, guess what I did? I carried an Ethernet cord around everywhere, and I was that guy. Okay. So, and I was using Acme. So I was using the Acme editor with an Ethernet cord in my graph theory class to draw, complicated graph phys graphics. If that's what you're doing something wrong, right? And trying to collaborate on LaTeX, Overleaf, and all these other things, a nightmare. So that's the kind of friction that I kept encountering. And so I love everything that Luke Smith put out. I love all of it, and I think the most important thing for me is that he led me to, him and a couple other influences, mostly actually outside off YouTube, books, actually, kind of in a serendipitous way. But he was another major source. He led me to Holy Orthodoxy, right? And I'm always going to be grateful for that. But as a result of that, all the fear of, man, we live in a surveillance state, or we got to use free and open source software because these things are spying on us. It's like, I have Christ. I don't really care anymore. It's like, yeah, it's a surveillance state, but I can at least use that to my advantage. And, I have Christ and all of his saints. I care more about that, and looking back, if you're like talking to your girlfriend, you're like, oh, I have to fire up the Jitsi server, and you're making like a girl use that, what are you doing, right? So I've kind of moved away from all of this stuff, and you gain a lot. Like, this is the most powerful machine I've ever used, and you gain FaceTime, iMessage, and all these other things. And I think most importantly, aside from no one caring about like what scripts you're using, I mean, kids find this stuff super interesting because they've never seen it before. But like, as an adult, it doesn't matter how POSIX compliant your shell script is if you can't even, open LinkedIn, and so I think what anyone would notice is when you're using these free software tools, you're spending a lot of time just configuring. You're just configuring your machine most of the time, or like you're spam refreshing RSS feeds, or you're meticulously tweaking the email headers on your server. And yeah, it costs less money. Hosting your mail server can theoretically be super cheap compared to like having a big Proton Mail instance or something. But even I've come around on that. Like, I'm now on Proton Mail. You'll notice, like, anyone who's following me, my email is now just a Proton Mail email. And I've even taken my website to a much smaller VPS just because, like, it was an interest, it was a hobby. But I think, like, that was cool 6 years ago. But things are so different even now. And so, a quick anecdote. One of the big things that we talked about in economics isn't so much actually a study about money at all as it is to responses to incentives. It's about behavior that you can empirically look at in response to an incentive. So actually, behavioral economics is really all about behavior. And so one of the biggest things we even discussed paper-wise, like one of the biggest papers, was about how people running a marathon had very specific mile finish times that rounded to the nearest minute because of the incentive of winning. But it was the incentive of winning that allowed you to analyze the behavior of practicing for the race. But you weren't analyzing the actual incentive. The incentive was the means of studying the actual behavior of discipline, right? And the whole paper was about that, and how you can piece that apart and say that, well, actually, it's about the incentive. It's not about psychological factors for rounding up, and that's a nice number. No, it's about actually training for a specific time. And so I guess this kind of opens into a broader even discussion of social media. Like, people in the kind of indie or suckless, for lack of a better word, web, there's kind of this paranoia about these big companies like Facebook and Twitter, and I think or X, and I think that's, there's some reason to be concerned about that. But as I said before, like, it's time to get serious. And really, I mean, what do we care about? We should care more about fearing God, if I'm going to be real, than like, oh my goodness, they used my face to aggregate into their AI. That's creepy, and like, we shouldn't be making software that does that. But I mean, it doesn't, in aggregate, like, it's kind of unescapable now. Like, you go out in public, there's going to be face tracking cameras, and virtually like every major store, like Lowe's, for example, does that. But I guess, in a broader discussion of free software, because free software kind of goes hand in hand with like the leaving, social media sphere, or, dumb phones like graphene. I was really into graphene, but for the same reason, like, you can't really operate very well, at least compared to an iPhone. Like, you can't FaceTime people, and that's really, I mean, I'm kind of rambling, but that's my MO. Good luck talking to old people without like WhatsApp or FaceTime. It needs to be easy, and I think that's good. Convenience is important for collaboration. And if you're, that's what I want to say. If you're kind of like, if you're off social media, people talk a lot about how like if you're off social media, you're going to be more grounded, more present. But if you don't have an existing social structure, like if you don't have a bunch of people that you hang out with regularly, whether it work schedules or whatever, getting off social media is not going to give you that. I mean, it might through like sheer deprivation force you to acquire it, but all of the benefits of leaving social media are more or less moot if you're already kind of in a weird isolated situation. So as human beings, we do need operant conditioning, at least to some extent. And I don't really believe in that like we're irrational and we need to make bad decisions and we need libertarian paternalism to cure us. I don't really believe in that, and that's kind of like the overarching narrative of economics, at least in the field I studied. But I do believe that we do have bad behaviors, that we just have bad habits, and we have passions, right? And we have addictions, and it is very true that our behavior can be conditioned, and if we know how to do that, then we can very well take advantage of that, and we can use social media on ourselves to that, to that effect, or how we choose our friends. And so I think it's important that we don't leave these things totally in the dust. It's good to have some exposition, actually, I think, to what people that we know in our real lives are doing without having to talk about them. And I do think, leaving if you leave social media and you like have a website, this is what I did, and you put your blog posts there and your pictures there, I mean, that's cool. That's really cool. No one's gonna see it, Whereas if you have an Instagram or a Substack, you can put your stuff on Substack, what you're writing, people will see it. And if you're on Instagram, people will see that. And I think that's better. It's better because you're now part of a social thing. You're putting stuff online for people to see, and now people that are going to see it, because these things aren't exactly easy. And that's just the state of affairs today. Let's just be realistic. This kind of ties into something, actually, my Metropolitan talked about a couple weeks ago with social media. His idea is kind of that, there's nothing wrong with it inherently, but, our behavior can harm us. And it kind of talks to that divide between it being good but also being a means of temptation. So he talks about, he's really a big fan of St. Silouan the Athonite. And St. Silouan, this was back in a time actually when the only way of getting the news was through newspapers. And St. Silouan says, don't even read the news, it'll darken you. Which, realistically means no information, period. You have no idea what's going on. But a more modern saint, St. Porphyrios, in his little monastery that he built later in his life, always had a radio going at all times. And he says, you have to get a radio. How else am I supposed to know what I'm going to pray about today? I have to hear the news to know what to pray about. And that is totally juxtaposed, right? That's a contradiction. So what do we believe? What's the metric? And I keep harping on Priest Monk Cosmas a lot. And what he says is we need to listen to advice for our station. And, St. Silouan, St. Porphyrios, they're both saints who died in the past, but they lived at different times. Like St. Silouan was born in, I think, 1866, and St. Paisios in like 1906. Porphyrios, 1906. That's a lot more current to us. And he's talking to laymen. St. Silouan was, I believe in that quote, talking to another monk. But he was a solitary, whereas St. Porphyrios lived in the world, at least in the end of his life, when he talked about these things. So I think that should tell us that we're listening to something meant for a layman, right? And we have to use social media kind of soberly. It's a really good way to stay connected with people, thank God. But if it's a massive time sink for you, we have to cut it off. So that said, I think it can be used as an environment that does like optimally condition you to behave in a well-adjusted way. Keeping in touch with people that you went to university with, or even high school with, people in your hometown. So yeah, it's kind of my position, and I guess maybe I'll talk about more about in a separate video. But I think it's the wrong instinct to totally flee. I mean, maybe if you're like super addicted, it could be beneficial to you to give it a break. But to run away completely, I think, is fleeing from yourself into yourself, and that doesn't solve the problem. That's just cutting yourself off and isolating. So, long story short, I think it's time to leave some of these, more minimal free software things behind and start to go back into social media. To each his own.